Starting in the 1980s, you probably noticed men without hats. That's even more so today. So how did headwear go from saving lives to covering bald spots? There's 4 big reasons, and it's a story few would know off the top of their heads.
Come on in, everybody, don't be shy. Hats!
This hat thing starts way back. You see, for as long as there's been cloth, there's been headwear. Some of the earliest evidence we have of this dates back to about 27,000 years ago, thanks to Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Clay fragments discovered in the Czech Republic showed fairly clear impressions of woven fibers. Neolithic, Bronze, and Iron Age Europeans spun wool and sewed leather, so it stands to reason that they'd made things to protect their heads. And by the Antiquity period, hoods and capes were fairly common. Capes. Now there's something that really needs to come back. A nice business cape. Anyway, back to the hats. The ladies got in on the hat action too. By the 13th century, women were wearing hoods, capes, and even started wearing gorgets around their throats like the men in their culture. Hats were just starting to get cool. By the 17th century, hats had become outright outlandish, and the 18th century saw them largely replaced with wigs, though that didn't stop some people from trying to wear both at the same time, which is inconceivable.
That is saying something.
Round hats also came out around that era and were fairly popular by the mid-1800s. By that point, hats in general was so popular that no man in the Western world would think of leaving his house without one. Before long, people even started using events like the Kentucky Derby as an excuse to show their headwear off to their peers. And while all that happened, hats that are at least sort of in vogue today also began to gain popularity. The top hat was a symbol of change in the late 1700s, and it was popular with everyone throughout the next few centuries. The fedora and Homburg hats were also extremely famous during the early 20th century. Part of this was from the McCoy Act of 1909. Remember that one? Let's let Michael Keaton explain it.
It said immigrants who wanted citizenship had to stay out of their apartments at least 4 hours a day and walk around in the streets with hats on.
Well, not really. But come on, it's Johnny Dangerously. Anyway, enough about the long history of hats. What happened? Where did all the hats go? Well, when you clicked on this video, and thanks by the way, click subscribe if you haven't, I'd be willing to bet you probably didn't guess that highway expansion was in any way related to headwear trends, but bear with us for a minute. Dwight Eisenhower revolutionized America's highway system. He spent 2 months in a military convoy traveling cross-country in 1919, and by the end of that trip, he and his companions were pretty dadgum confident the US needed better roads. And while everyone risked with their coworkers about how they'd change things if they were in charge, Eisenhower actually became president and was able to make his plans a reality.
That's convenient.
Admittedly, the interstate system was nowhere near finished by the time he left office, but people did start to use cars more and more. And early automobiles just didn't have room for hats. So, unless you had a fedora or something that could be safely crushed, you could either skip the hat or hoof it. While early cars had more headroom or open roofs, roof heights had gotten lower and lower over time. These days, we challenge anyone to wear a Stetson in a smart car. When Eisenhower was inaugurated, he broke Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman's tradition of wearing a top hat to the ceremony. Instead, he opted for Homburg. It was only 2 in a row, but still 2 was a trend. So when it came time for John F. Kennedy to be sworn in, folks were hoping he'd bring back the top hat in a big way. The Baltimore Sun wrote at the time, "It is in its ceremonial aspect that the top hat is without peer." Kennedy ultimately did wear a top hat to his inauguration, though he often took it off to wave to the crowd. This small gesture convinced a lot of people that JFK was responsible for killing the top hat's popularity, but that's not exactly true. A 1928 New York Times article noted that university students had started foregoing the top hat decades before Kennedy's inauguration. So, if anything, Kennedy failed to bring back a dying fashion statement. But he certainly didn't put the final nail in the coffin. These days, hats are largely a fashion piece that people bust out regardless of the temperature.
Yeah, I guess, whatever, it's 96 degrees out. You better put on the old wool cap.
But a few centuries ago, they were a whole lot more essential to day-to-day living. Gentleman's Gazette reports that before modern heating systems came to be, men would wear hats indoors just to keep warm. Now that cars, houses, and most public buildings are fully heated, that's become less and less of a necessity. Similarly, more men have begun to work indoor office jobs in recent decades, so don't have to be exposed to the elements to make their living in the way they used to. Up until the 19th century, the main source of heat in a private home came from either the stove or hearth. Since stoves were usually in the middle of those buildings, other rooms could get very cold very easily. So those heavy pajamas you see in old movies and TV shows are more than just a fashion choice. In the late 19th century, steam, electric heating, and hot water radiators became more commonplace. By the mid-20th century, boilers and gas furnaces were also pretty popular. So the more accessible indoor heating became, the less people relied on their hats. And it's not just the cold. Modern raincoats help keep people dry these days, but the brim of a hat used to be one of the only lines of defense we had against wetter weather. Layering clothing more strategically helped keep people warm so they could rely less on hats. If someone makes a point of wearing heavy socks, solid closed-toed shoes, heavy pants, and thick shirts, there's only so much more a hat would do to aid their fights with the elements. And just to highlight how far this technology's come, it's important to note that those hats didn't do an amazing job even when people really needed them. Take a bowler hat, for example. It's hard to believe those skinny brims would make that big of a difference walking to the bus stop in the wind and rain. Even so, it was the best we had at one point, and depending on someone's economic class, even that might have been a luxury they couldn't afford. When World War II ended, a lot of men who served swore off hats when they came home. After years of being forced to wear military headgear, they'd completely lost their appeal. Since so many men served in the war, hats became significantly less common among men after the second half of the 1940s. In fact, according to the Hat Research Foundation, and yes, that's a real thing, 19% of men who didn't wear hats said the fact that they had to in the army was the reason. The other thing was that pesky education system. You see, many men of that generation were probably forced to wear hats or caps as schoolboys, which surely have inspired some people to reject hats altogether once they had complete control over their outfits. If anything's gonna make you stop doing something, it's being forced to do it in school. Take that, math. Once enough men started going without hats, it became less strange to others. It's wild to think about now, but being shunned for not wearing a hat was a real threat back then. So seeing so many peers go without caps must have been quite a relief. There's this other weird little thing that caused hats to go out of style. At different points throughout history, the type of hat you wore was also a mark of your social class. Each country handled this a little differently, but with social classes changing rapidly in the 19th and 20th centuries, hats began to fade out as a major class signifier. In an attempt to cross class lines, the English middle classes started wearing the bowler hats worn by the upper classes in the 19th century. Meanwhile, the Social Meanings of Hats and T-shirts reports that the lower classes often wore flat caps. In the US, the division between social classes was a bit less stark, but workers who might have worn flat caps during their shifts may have thrown on bowler hats when they were out on the town. But as time went on, dress became less formal across the board and people started to take more diverse jobs, so hats faded away as a class indicator. These days, the rich and famous often dress just like everyone else. We've all heard the phrase, "come inside, you'll catch a cold," but a few centuries ago, that sentence pretty much meant, "come inside, you're gonna die." Before antibiotics were invented, common illnesses were often death sentences. The vast majority of children suffering from bacterial meningitis died, and a simple cold could turn into a fatal case of tuberculosis or pneumonia. Then came the 1940s and the discovery of penicillin. The miracle drug saved countless lives during World War II and turned many once deadly diseases into a minor inconvenience. Before that, and especially before indoor heating was widely accessible, keeping a hat on was essential for not getting sick. But suddenly, leaving the house without a hat wasn't a life-threatening decision. Of course, people still wear winter hats to stay warm, but those Carhartt beanies aren't exactly saving lives. So why don't guys wear those fancy hats anymore? Cars, school, AC, and drugs. Sure, I'll say it. I'll bet that knocked your hat off.